Well, first of all, I'm going to say I'm a historian by training, and what we do when we give papers is we just sit there and read them to people. So that's kind of what I'm going to do here. I apologize, it's a little boring, but it's way more comfortable than seeing me try to speak extemporaneously. So I'm going to begin with some sort of prefatory remarks and go from there. I started researching this topic about a little over a year ago, when I came across this image. I was researching Gus Maker, who was one of the earliest cartoonists to have a strip appear in the daily newspapers rather than in the Sunday colored supplement. What we see here is Gus Maker on the banjo with Walt Kuhn on guitar, who I knew as the man who spearheaded the organization of the Armory Show, which took place here in this building a little over 100 years ago. The manic dancing fellow was a painter named George Overbury Hart, or Pop Hart, who I was not familiar with. I became curious about what a cartoonist like Maker was doing with these painters. Further research revealed to me that Walt Kuhn had been a cartoonist himself and had also associated with many cartoonists. In fact, given the setting and the picture and the people in the picture, I've been able to deduce fairly certainly that the photo was taken at a dingy New Jersey dive called the Palisades Yacht Club, which was sort of a highfalutin name for what was essentially a crummy little bar on a cliff. And they had a porch on one side, a little bit of a boardwalk, and I think if you look over there, the slightly raised thing is where there was a flagpole. That was actually, it was that crummy of a place that was actually a landmark of it. And at this club, Kuhn and Hart and Maker would meet and socialize with other artists, including the Katzenjammer kids, Rudolph Dirks. Here they would sketch, have little parties, and socialize. At that point, I started to feel like I was onto something. I started to see this small group of cartoonists interacting in events like the Armory Show with high art, asserting a place for themselves within the world of high art, which sort of surprised me. We're used to this narrative of comics as a low art form, one that has only in the last 40 years or so become accepted at all within the world of high art, and then only begrudgingly and often not without conflict. So what does it mean to our understanding of comics? I started wondering, to see these early strip cartoonists interacting with the world of high art. I feel like I'm reverbing a little bit. How were things different then? What did this sort of participation in the most important event in early 20th century American art mean for how we understand what comics meant and how they were received back then? So that's when the whole direction of my dissertation started to change and take its final shape. I wanted to interrogate how cartoonists, newspaper comic strip cartoonists in particular, negotiated issues of respectability, propriety, and class in progressive era America. So to set the stage, let me talk for a little bit about the nature of newspaper comics before 1913. I'm assuming, given the audience, that many of you know the basics. Comic strips were usually much shorter lived than we're used to today, or even than we were accustomed to in the 50s and 60s before the rise of ubiquitous legacy strips. Most comic strips tended to last only until either the audience or the cartoonist got sick of the same gag over and over, because comics were almost exclusively humor strips and fairly simple ones. Serial continuity hadn't really come into vogue yet, so instead most comics riffed on a fairly limited theme for as long as they could before the cartoonist moved on. While comics had begun to appear in daily newspapers, these were peppered throughout the newspaper rather than on a single comics page, and were usually at least semi-irregular still. So the big show was still the Sunday supplement. This had begun with Pulitzer's New York World and was soon emulated by William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal. The supplements proved surprisingly popular, actually driving sales. Cartoonists were enough of a draw to drive readership from one paper to another, leading to fairly predatory hiring practices on the part of both Hearst and Pulitzer, where they would hire a cartoonist out from one another. The color supplements began as an emulation of middle-class humor magazines like Puck, Life, and Judge. I believe that this emulation was deployed deliberately, at least in part, to give the yellow press some respectability. Just a couple years after Hearst began publishing his humor supplement. In 1897, Library Journal reported that there was a wave of libraries that had begun to remove the World and Journal from their reading rooms. The humor magazines, on the other hand, had in the last 15 years or so gone from being less acceptable to being very accepted, and most libraries stocked several copies of each. So whatever the reasons, the comics page were almost immediately successful and inspired not only readership, but merchandising that rivaled even the humor magazine's most successful merchandising properties like the Brownies and Ally Sloper. The first character to successfully be merchandised, the Yellow Kid, inspired all sorts of branded merchandise, from gum to pinbacks to my favorite, which is this one, the Yellow Kid's Highball. I found this at the Geppies Entertainment Museum in Baltimore. If you look closely at his shirt, which is sort of how the Yellow Kid addresses his audience, it says, "Hully G, this booze is great, see?" So it's a little different than branded merchandise today with comic strips. The other thing that's important to understand about Comics Page in 1913 is it has recently come under attack. There was a moral panic around Sunday Comics Page that began around 1909 and lasted for several years. This article from the Ladies' Home Journal, which is just one of many that I could have selected, described the Sunday comics as a crime against American children and a demoralizing influence that was vulgarizing the minds of the young. Looking at the voices that were most active in this anti-comics crusade, one quickly comes to realize that it was an assortment of different groups with different prerogatives that brought them together into conflict with the Sunday comics. Rival newspapers like the New York Times, who were deeply invested in a brand built on having less sensational, more impartial journalism than the yellow papers, were more than glad to contribute to the press that the movement got. Progressive journals like The Outlook, which was probably the top publisher of anti-comics editorials during the time period, were interested in the cultural and social uplift and were concerned about the kinds of reading that children were doing. In this, they were joined by organizations like the International Kindergartens Union. And when you look at this picture, we might be able to imagine why kindergarten teachers might not find comics the most appropriate reading for young children. This is an illustrated geography lesson in Kelly's kindergarten from 1898 or so, I think. So I've gone a long way off from Cartoonists at the Armory Show, but I think it's important because it helps us contextualize what was going on here. Art historian Michelle Bogart has argued that fine art and commercial art have never coexisted happily, but their differences have never been fixed. Bogart describes the ascendance of print, mass media, advertising, and other forms of commercial illustration as creating a brief golden age of American illustration, which occurred approximately between 1880 and 1930. This is a period when illustrators were much more a part of the art world than they were ever before or after. However, as early as 1910, enthusiasm faded and many observers perceived the forces of commerce to be adversely affecting the intents and practices of artists and to be encroaching inappropriately into realms of experience once deemed private. The standing of illustration was diminished. Cartoonists, working for the working class yellow press and turning out a project that was deeply commercial, were especially at risk of this drop in status. While illustrators for middle-class magazines were organizing the Society of Illustrators, which really started picking up around this time, and they are our hosts today, in an effort to bring respectability against claims of commercialism, some newspaper cartoonists who had artistic aspirations were embracing the art of Europe in an attempt to gain respectability. The rest of this lecture will deal with a small number of cartoonists who made that decision, which at last brings us to the 1913 Armory Show. And having gone upstairs now, I've never actually been here before, and it's incredible to see like pictures like this, which is a little pixelated, I apologize, and to try to, when you go upstairs, try to imagine this is the same place. It's really awesome. The Armory Show was a watershed event for American art. It was the first major event that exposed audiences in the United States to the modernist avant-garde that had been fermenting in Europe. The Armory Show also helped overturn the system of juries, credentialing, and academies that was the cornerstone of artistic professionalization at the time, and replacing it with a more free-form associationalism. I'm really sorry, kid. There were actually several newspaper cartoonists involved in the Armory Show. There were essentially two groups. First, there were the members of Walt Kuhn's inner circle, including Kuhn himself. Kuhn was one of the primary organizers of the exhibition. Along with him, you have Rudolph Dirks and Gus Maker, his close friends and associates. The second group are cartoonists associated with Robert Henry and the Ashcan School, George Lukes, Margery Oregon, and Dennis Wortman. Finally, there were a couple who seemed to fit into neither group. So this Walt Kuhn he was a founding member of the Association of American Painters and Sculptors, the organization that held the Armory Show. Kuhn was, at this point, primarily still a cartoonist. At the time, his cartooning, conducted for major magazines like Puck and Judge, as well as for newspapers, was his primary source of income, as it would continue to be until 1914. He drew one early strip, a children's fantasy called Whisk, which you can see here, for the New York World between February of 1909 and October of 1910. After that, Kuhn had a weekly panel in the Brooklyn Eagle called Funny Birds that ran from April through December of 1912. By December of 1912, Kuhn had been in Europe since September and was likely too busy gathering paintings for the Armory Show to continue to draw the strip. Gus Maker was primarily known at the time for his Maker's Monks series, and here's one of those there. Although calling it a series is a bit of a misnomer, it ran under no particular title, but rather the strips were named after the monk who starred in the particular comic that day, such as Nervo the Monk, Groucho the Monk, Sherlocko the Monk, etc. This clever naming device would later serve as a convention by which the Marx Brothers chose their names, and Groucho actually is named after Groucho the Monk. So his line was sketchy at times, sort of nervous seeming. He had definite understated quality. Maker was never one to draw more than he needed, and his backgrounds were minimal. His cartooning is almost simple to the extreme. Maker's painting, likewise, is almost completely without affectation. His father had been a diamond setter and hoped that he would go into jewelry design. While he did find work in a jewelry factory, his passion was for drawing and painting. He had no formal education in art, though he did take some live drawing classes at the Newark Sketch Club, where he fell under the tutelage of Paul Reiniger, a mostly forgotten artist who he compared to Van Gogh in both temperament and genius. Reiniger killed himself soon after, but he remained among the strongest influences on Maker, along with later Cezanne and especially Van Gogh. While many American artists of the Armory Show are remembered as being somewhat behind the times and conservative, his two pieces are painterly, simplistic almost to the point of naivete, and show a strong post-impressionist influence. While not as bracingly anti-representational as the Cubists, he was hardly the academic representational work or historical paintings that many discussions of the Armory Show might have us believe that the American works were. Rudolph Dirks, the creator of the Katzenjammer Kids, is one of the best remembered early cartoonists. Modeled after the Bilderbogen Max und Moritz by Wilhelm Busch, the Katzis, as they were affectionately called, pioneered many uses of devices that eventually became part of the standard visual language of comics, including parallel lines and dust clouds to indicate speed, dotted lines to represent eye contact, sweat beads to suggest fear or nervousness. The Armory Show occurred at a precarious time for Dirks. He had just decided to jump ship from the New York World to the New York World from Hearst's New York Journal. Shortly after the strip's beginning, the Spanish-American War had erupted, and Dirks took a year off to serve. And by 1912, he kind of felt like he was entitled to another break. This time, he wanted to tour Europe with his wife and work on his painting. He attempted to send strips over from Europe, but communications quickly broke down between him and Hearst Comics editor Rudolph Bloch. Dirks would later recall that his work was repeatedly sent back to him to redraw while in Europe, which was an untenable situation because it meant that until he redrew it again, he received no pay. Bloch, on the other hand, would reject this claim. Whatever actually transpired, after about 13 strips were finished, Dirks quit doing the strip altogether and soon decided to join the World and go over there. This set off a legal battle that lasted for about a year. during which time nobody published the Katzenjammer Kids. So actually, during the time of the Armory Show, I believe there wouldn't have been a Katzenjammer Kids in any newspaper. Dirks lost the initial battle, but on appeal, it was determined that he should be allowed to continue the strip at the World under a different title, The Captain and the Kids. But Hearst's paper would be able to retain the title and continue the strip with a new artist. This battle was just starting to heat up as the Armory Show opened its doors and wouldn't be resolved for some time. Much as with Maker, Dirks seems to have been largely self-taught, preferring landscapes and portraits, and again, in a largely post-impressionistic style. Kuhn, Dirks, and Maker were all members, along with Tad Dorgan and George McManus, of the Kit Kat Club, an organization of artists and illustrators that began in 1881. The Kit Kat Club members were somewhat divided over the new modernist artists, however, and eventually came to a head over some watercolors by the French artist Pasquin. And there's a great line that I don't actually have in here, where Pasquin, basically a bunch of the illustrators in the Kit Kat Club got upset because Pasquin drew whores, but then Pasquin said the problem is that they all draw whores and they don't know it. It's a really clever line there, but I wish I'd written it down. This rift led in 1916 to the creation of the Penguin Club, who hosted the first and only show by the English vorticists, as well as works by Man Ray, Diego Rivera, Raymond Duchamp-Villon, Joseph Stello, Pablo Picasso, Picabia, and many others. And that's just in the first show they put on. What's particularly interesting about the Penguin Club is not just their commitment to modernism, but the fact that the club seems to be primarily illustrators, including many cartoonists. Artists were moving from a more formal membership and jury approach to a more open one that was founded on associationalism, like-mindedness, and conviviality. Social networks were replacing formal ones, and while we see these overlapping networks, we see how much these cartoonists, just as much as the painters, sculptors, and the like, were part of, and indeed at times central to, these events. Three other strip cartoonists can be connected to the Armory Show through another key figure, Robert Henry. Henry was the organizer of the earlier Independent Artists Show, which is seen as a precursor to the Armory Show, and also a sort of de facto leader to the Ashcan School. Margery Oregon was one of the first women to draw a strip for a newspaper. Her first and longest running was a strip called Little Reggie and the Heavenly Twins, and there's one example here of that, for Hearst's New York Journal, which ran between 1902 and 1905. She also ran caricatures of theatrical celebrities for the World. In 1908, she married Robert Henry. Walt Kuhn had pointed Henry out to her and encouraged her to go to some of his lectures. They were soon actually introduced by Rudolph Dirks. So you see how this is all very incestuous. And they married within a few months. Oregon pretty much ceased producing comics at this point and was mostly content to play a supporting role to Henry, managing the household, arranging the model's pose when necessary, and providing Victrola music did not help her concentrate on her own work, as Henry scholar William Homer explained, noting that she was philosophical about it, and most of the time considered Henry's art more important than hers. That said, she was still producing some art and had 6 drawings in the Armory Show. George Lukes is actually remembered primarily for his work as an Ashcan School painter, but he was also Hearst's replacement on Hogan's Alley, the Yellow Kid strip, when Outcall jumped ship to the other paper. Pardon me, I wrote that wrong. He was Pulitzer's replacement when he jumped over to Hearst's. John Golden, who was at the World Art Department when with Lukes after Outcall's departure, would later recall William Randolph, and this is a sort of a block quote from him. William Randolph Hearst came along and coaxed Outcall into bringing the Yellow Kid over to the Journal, whereupon Joe Pulitzer, irked by this theft of one of his artists, had a certain newcomer imitate the strip, and for quite a while we had 2 Yellow Kids running. Everybody in the business considered this highly unethical, and in fact many of the boys stopped talking to the young imitator artist. The years passed and I became a producer. One day my secretary came in and said that there was a man outside to see me, and of course, as you must guess, it was the ostracized cartoonist. He said, "Look here, John Golden, you don't have to be so high-hat with me. I don't draw any silly cartoons anymore. I move around with the best of them. I paint kings and queens, and I get more for a single painting than I did in a whole year's cartooning. So don't be so stuck up with me. I'm just as important as you are. To me, this story has a ring of someone who was deeply hurt by exclusion from the social network of artists with whom he was at the time in daily contact. He seems to have seen his relative success as a fine artist as a comeuppance to that exclusion, an attitude that might suggest that he saw the commercial work that he did as related, contiguous, if not equivalent, to his high artwork later on. Finally, the last artist within the orbit of Henry is Dennis Wortman. Wortman studied under Henry and Kenneth Hayes Miller at the Chase School from 1906 to 1909, attending at the same time as Rockwell Kent, Edward Hopper, and George Bellows. He exhibited with George Lukes just a year before the Armory Show. He was primarily a landscape painter until, when he was stationed at the Great Lakes Naval Training Station during World War I, some of his sketches of sailors ended up making their way to the New York Tribune, which ran them. After the war, he started looking for work as an illustrator. When Roland Kirby stopped working on Metropolitan Movies, a slice-of-life single-panel strip in 1924, Worthman took it over. Worthman's one painting in the exhibition was a Bermuda waterfront scene, and this is one of the only ones where I was able to find a color picture of the thing that was actually at the Armory Show. So I've just been finding most of the things you've seen here have been sort of contemporary, slightly before, slightly after. This is actually the painting that was at the Armory Show. So he did a Bermuda waterfront scene. I lost my place because I got excited about that. What's ironic about this is that Worthman's later work as a cartoonist would be much closer to the Ashcan school, of which Henry was a part, than his earlier works. After the war, Wortman would realize that while the Ashcan school paintings and sketches were lessening in popularity due to the increasing appetites for modernism among American art buyers, there was still a market for the same sort of radicalism that Arthur B. Davies was embodying in the masses, as long as it shifted toward a slightly more cagey liberalism. With the stock market crash a few years after he took over, through all the Roosevelt years, Wortman advocated for the poor, showed men and women on picket lines, people out of work and looking for work, and showed generally how the other half lived. Forgotten in the last half century, he's only recently become rediscovered and reevaluated as an artist and as a social advocate, and has recently had several exhibitions and books. I have one cartoonist that I'll just put up here who I still haven't learned much about because he's a more recent discovery for me. That's a Pulitzer cartoonist named T.E. Powers. I have yet to establish any necessary connection between him and Kuhn or any of the others. I've included a full-page Sunday strip here as more of a placeholder than anything else. If anyone has any suggestions about where I can find any information about T.E. Powers, unlike most of these other painters, none of his papers are at the Archives of American Art and stuff, so I'm just sort of running up against some brick walls. Please grab me after this, talk to me. Finally, we come to the eccentric and mysterious Herbert Crowley. Little's known about Crowley. His strip, The Wiggle Much, ran in the New York Herald from March through June of 1910. I've yet to discover any connection between Crowley and any of the other cartoonists who were involved in the Armory Show. He did marry a woman who was a director at one of the major progressive houses here in New York, and that marriage lasted a few years, and they moved to Europe and actually fell into Jung's circle. So I can find some social connections, but none to any of these other artists. But that's itself sort of telling. It sort of points to an openness and inclusion of the show, and that it wasn't all simply social networks and who you knew. One could simply be included for making good art and being forward-thinking. Walt Kuhn, being in charge of the press and promotions for the exhibition, worked very hard to make the show reach as wide an audience as possible. In a letter to Edward Gooey, or Goey, I'm not sure, who actually was also another strip cartoonist who had left New York to go be an editor in Kansas City, he wrote, I could furnish you with a fine section of photos, and in fact, a story if you require it, which would make a very attractive Sunday page. We're doing this according to the American methods and have already spent a good deal of money on advertising. Kuhn's American methods of promotion for the event focused primarily on marketing it to a mass audience that went beyond the typical art world. Wood Gaylor would later recall that Kuhn's instructions to us that we were, in distributing posters, to put them in every gin mill on 2nd, 3rd, and 9th Avenue, to go to the parts of town that would not ordinarily think in terms of art exhibitions. Kuhn wanted to reach a mass audience, not simply those who would come to art shows. He even actually went in and priced the price of a electric sign on Times Square, which I really wish they had gotten, because that would have just been a great photo. The Armory Show was, in a way that no other art event before it has been, a product not just of high culture, but of mass culture. Arthur Stieglitz would, the next year, describe it as a sensational success, possibly primarily a success of sensation. Others were perhaps less forgiving. Theodore Roosevelt, in an article for The Outlook, the same magazine that had been the most vocal crusader against comics pages, talked of the power to make folly lucrative, which the late P.T. Barnum showed with his faked mermaid. And here is the Fiji mermaid. Roosevelt said, "There are thousands of people who will pay small sums to look at a fake mermaid. And now and then, one of this kind with enough money will buy a cubist picture, or a picture with a misshapen nude woman, repellent from every standpoint." So this comparison to Barnum, it was probably made just to imply that he was a trickster or a bunco man, was actually really accurate. In The Arts of Deception, historian James W. Cook describes Barnum's tricksterism as in a somewhat more nuanced way than Roosevelt's outright dismissal. In Cook's analysis, Barnum was not simply duping his audience, but was giving them a controlled means by which to explore a new epistemological uncertainty by inviting them to debate the veracity of his claims. Barnum's audience weren't just paying to be fooled, but rather paying to take part in a game of discernment, where coming to a consensus about the truth or untruth around any item was the primary enjoyment. Kuhn trusted the power of this new art, especially of those of the Cubists and other high modernists, and thought that it would be perceptible to some members of the general public. So he invited the whole public to come see them and to let them decide for themselves if this new art was really revolutionary or just nonsense. In playing Barnum in this way, he ensured the lasting place of the Armory Show in American memory. When the exhibition traveled to Chicago, he and Frederick James Gregg even published a pamphlet titled For and Against, which was made up of newspapers and magazine articles that argued for and against the exhibit. So they actually framed the debate and gave it to everyone when they walked in the room, basically. Audience reaction was definitely split. The Cubists attracted the most negative attention, particularly Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase #2, which received the most written attention, being described as, variously, a lot of disused golf clubs and bags, a dynamited suit of Japanese armor, or most popularly, an explosion in a shingle factory. The American art at the show, by comparison, was praised for its relative sanity and in comparison to the European freak canvases. On the other hand, at the end of the show's three-city tour of New York, Chicago, and Boston, 174 works had been sold, and only 51 of them were by Americans, despite the fact that Americans made up the vast majority of the exhibition. Several cartoonists weighed in with their own takes of the exhibit as well. This is one from the New York Evening Sun, and it's by J.P. Griswold. It's called "The Rude Descending a Staircase," with the subtitle "Rush Hour at the Subway." This is perhaps one of the best-known cartoons in response to the Armory Show. It's generally been read as an unfriendly appraisal of Cubist works, but I would argue, however, that viewing these cartoons solely as an expression of public discomfort with or confusion at modern art overlooks the similarities of their project. Cartoonists were developing a visual language at that time which depicted movement over time through the use of abstracted, iconic images. It seemed just as likely that a cartoon may not be so much a rejection. This cartoon might not be so much a rejection of Cubism, but a winking nod of the similarity of these projects, as well as a playful way to begin to utilize some of the Cubists' tools and techniques in a manner that would be palatable to a wide audience. Looking at another example, Louis Glacken's March 19th, 1913 cover for Puck. It's the latest in Easter eggs. So while the ridiculousness of a rooster laying Cubist eggs is obvious and fairly comical, and the rooster's face reflects an amusing pompousness, I would argue that it's deeply reductive to read this cartoon as simply mocking the artists of the Armory Show, or as an outright rejection of modernism and abstraction. One reason I would argue this is that the cartoonist, Louis Glackens, was the brother of the Ashcan School's William Glackens, who was exhibited in the Armory Show. William and Edith Glackens were lifelong friends of both Walt Kuhn and his wife Vera, and Glackens was an integral part of the planning of the Armory Show. While it's not inconceivable that the brothers Glackens might not have seen eye to eye when it comes to the merits of Cubism and abstraction, I believe there's another reason to read this cartoon as not just a simple reflection of public reaction. The trope of birds in a barnyard setting is actually a leitmotif in many of Walt Kuhn's cartoons, and here's just two examples I was able to grab. And if you remember, his second strip was about birds in the Brooklyn Eagle. Many examples from Kuhn's work involve birds and barnyards, usually to contrast and gently mock urban pretensions, fads, and foibles. To me, it seems likely that this Puck cover, while it played to a public still unsure of what to make of Cubism, was also a playful jab at a fellow Puck cartoonist and a family friend. And if some of the cartoonists may have seen the similarity of these projects of modernism in the comic strip, there's also some hints, however small and anecdotal, that some of the moderns may have also been influenced by comics. In the autobiography of Alice B. Tolkis, Gertrude Stein, writing in the voice of her lover, recalls calling on Picasso in 1907. Picasso, and I'm going to mutilate this, my pronunciation is horrible, Fernand Oliver, that's as good as I can do, were in the middle of one of their many fights. As they leave, Stein pauses at the door, and I quote, "Oh, I forgot to give you these," said Gertrude Stein, handing Picasso a package of newspapers. They will console you." He opened them up. They were the Katzenjammer kids. Oh oui, he said, his face full of satisfaction. "Merci, thanks, Gertrude," and we left. Later, it's hinted at that Stein gives Picasso Sunday supplements on a regular basis and that he's a regular reader of them and a big fan of the Katzenjammer kids. The idea that Picasso was familiar with American comics and with Dirks' work in particular is especially appealing. Journalist Jonathan Jones has pointed out pointed to the famous story of Picasso's portrait of Gertrude Stein, which we have here, which was painted between 1905 and 1906. She sat for hours, 80 or 90 sessions, but neither party was pleased with the result. Finally, Picasso simply painted over her face. "I can't see you anymore when I look," Picasso said. He went on a trip to Italy, and when he returned, he went back to the painting with renewed vigor, painting Stein in her absence. And both were pleased with the results. Jones argues that it was, as much as African masks and other influences, as much as anything, this is another quote, sorry, as much as anything, the distorted, vibrant, violent, grotesque, fantastically modern graphic world of American newspaper comics that helped Picasso break out of every convention of continuity in art and helped him paint a portrait that is like a cartoon but with gravitas. Some years later, when Matthew Josephson fell in with the Dadaists around 1921, they were fascinated by all things American, from film and magazines to newspapers, advertisements, dime novels, looking at all of them as transmitters of folklore. Among the things that Josephson had brought with him from America was a collection of clippings of George Harriman's Crazy Cat. He showed them to the Dadaists, and they proclaimed them pure American Dada poetry. In all these cases, it's hard to pin down exactly how much influence American cartoonists may have had on modernist European artists, but the real key here is that they were familiar with, and in some cases quite fond of them. The split between high art and low culture, and between the cultural primacy of Europe as a hotbed of modernity as opposed to America as a cultural backwater, these assumptions that underwrite many narratives of the Armory Show and of this cultural moment generally are definitely challenged by such stories. Ultimately, though, this wasn't the beginning of the acceptance of comics by the art world. Kuhn and Oregon left comics altogether for high art, or in Oregon's case, just supporting an artist. Gus Maker seems to have gotten more attention after the Armory Show, showing around town with the Penguin Club and elsewhere, but comics were still his bread and butter, and he's largely forgotten outside of collectors of old comic strips. Likewise, Dirks, whose son followed in his footsteps as both a cartoonist, continuing his father's strip, and as a sculptor of minor repute, is ultimately remembered as a cartoonist rather than as a painter. Dennis Wortman's transition from a painter to cartoonist after the First War, in some ways, is the most telling. There was money in comics. In 1922, Sidney Smith, the creator of the Gumps, signed the first $1 million contract offered to a strip cartoonist. Workman was able to make a comfortable income while creating work that has a strong social agenda. He was involved in the Academy of Illustrators, the only cartoonist of his time who was, but he was, at the end of the day, just a newspaper cartoonist. By the time Martin Sheridan was conducting the interviews that would make up Comics and Their Creators, which is one of the earliest collections of interviews with cartoonists, one notices that few of the younger artists discuss painting or any other art, and many even take as a point of pride stories about getting kicked out of art school. Antagonism from cartoonists, many of whom were read worldwide and well paid for their work, had begun to take hold in reaction to rejection by the gatekeepers of high culture. Nevertheless, it's interesting to look at this one short moment when history suggests a possible different path, when maybe comics could have been accepted as an art form before pop art and the ironic detachment of postmodernism. And when one looks at comics from the period between 1895 and 1915, one's immediately struck with the sense of pressing modernity. The chaotic social scenes, the visual experimentation, the anarchic questioning of all the old orders, these are unquestionably the products of the same zeitgeist that informed the move toward modernism. So perhaps it shouldn't be surprises that few of their ranks were present at the most important show of modern art in American history. And that's, thanks. And we do have a few minutes. I don't know if anyone has any questions or if you guys want to get out of here early, feel free to do either. Oh, yes?
Is your article online?
Not really. It's okay. I have, this is parts of 2 dissertation chapters. I did early pre-writing, that's on my blog, leisurelyhistorian.net. And yesterday, actually, there's a short article, it's only about 800 words, that I just published on hyperallergic, so that's there, with a couple different pictures, too, if you want to see a few more pieces by some of these guys. And it doesn't have all the cartoonists named, it's sort of more of a highlights reel, but...
Google your name.
Yeah, that'll work. Yes?
I have 2 different questions. That was really interesting. The Historical Society had a big show about the Armory this year.
Mm-hmm. I went and saw that. It was great.
It was great. I don't remember this subject coming up at all. Did it come up? And does it come up? It's been studied so much.
I was a little disappointed. There was the one painting that was, it was the Fauvists, and half of them were monkeys.
Oh, yeah.
And that was one that was done actually by one of the artists who was in the show in reaction to, I think, basically the amount of fanfare that the Europeans got. They did have you checked out the volume that they put out with that? Like sort of, I want to call it a catalog, but it's more like a textbook. Yeah, it's huge. But there's one chapter where I love it. It's amazing, and I'm a little bitter about it because it rips off some ideas that I came up with on my own, but about cartoons in response. But there's not much on the cartoonist participation.
Yeah.
And I mean, numerically they're insignificant, really, in the scope of things, which is something I'm having trouble convincing my committee on.
Except that Kuhn was the organizer.
Exactly.
And that group was a pretty core group of American artists.
Exactly. When you look especially at the connection, I mean, the Ashcan school seems almost divorced from Kuhn and these other guys, but then when you look at the fact that Kuhn and Dirks hooked Henri up with his wife, it was a small circle back then, and
Glackens was part of that.
Glackens and a lot of those guys.
Yeah.
So I think it's actually, because I think when you look at the American works, there's sort of two layers of it, and one layer of it is this core, which really is based around social networks. And these guys, when you really look at it, are at the heart. They are, so connected to these social networks. And then there was this sort of outside element too, where people were able, it was a non-juried, open event. So people were able to, they invited a bunch of people, and then they gave all those people invitations. And they were like, if you know anyone who got anything good, give them that. You can, I think there's a copy of those online at the Archives of American Art. So, yes?
I was just going to make an observation, because I work at the Montclair Art Museum, and we did a show focusing on American artists in the Armory Show.
Yeah.
We did a little bit of research, and we published a catalog on that subject as well. Last year, actually, it came out at the same time as the Armory Show in February.
Yeah.
And so
I've got your catalog.
Oh, you do?
Actually,
Oh, okay, great. Well, anyway, I just wanted to kind of make the observation that I think possibly the interest in including the cartoonists, we specifically, of course, had to do with Walt Kuhn, who was going around very personally inviting people who were friends and associates of his to submit work. But I also think it has something to do with a broader vision in terms of a circular, an invitation they sent out where they said, we want works in all mediums. There were people who submitted embroidery. There were examples of painted china in the show. So I think it's sort of part of that whole broad liberal vision about it.
I absolutely agree, and I have not actually brought that enough out. That's a good point. And this is a really weird question. Did you call me?
Did I call you? Maybe I did.
I got a phone call from one of the curators of that.
Oh, I think I know what it is. I co-curated the show with Lorette McCarthy.
Yes, okay, so it wasn't, okay. She called me, and then I
did.
didn't get my voicemail because I didn't know I had voicemail on I just started a new job. And I took so long to get back to her, and she never called me back. So if you happened to be her, I was like, oh, I need to touch base. But okay.
I was going to ask for your card.
Oh, I don't have one, but I'll give you my information.
Okay.
Definitely. Go ahead.
I also wondered, do you know of any other period or place where there's so many people at a high level with both painters and cartoonists?
Well, like I said, I think it actually now would be basically the other answer. I think for a long time, a lot of cartoonists were sort of embittered toward mainstream high art forms. I think that there was a rejection of being rejected. And yeah, when you look at those, because the comics and their creators, he picked the right time. He was able to interview some of the earliest. He was able to interview folks like Dirks and other people like that. He was able to interview Chick Young. He was able to interview, I think, a lot of the major action strip people, because of that had come around. And it's really striking when you go through these that anyone who's not of that first generation, so many people have these stories about getting kicked out of art school, about lasting for one semester, about being told they could never paint, about all this stuff. So I think that there was sort of a detachment. There's a book called Comics versus Art by Bart Beatty that sort of talks about this, but he starts in the 50s when it's all sort of settled. And that's another thing that really got me going on this, is that I wanted to talk about how we got there in the first place, because he's sort of looking at it as like, he takes this triumphalist arch where we go from comics as a depreciated medium to comics being accepted, and we don't get this sort of like, how did they get to be so depreciated? Because they were low art, and they were, mass media, and they were commercial, but they weren't there wasn't a mutual disdain quite in the same way I feel like early on. It was a learned thing, not just a natural thing. And I think whenever, as historians, whenever we talk about anything being natural, we're usually on the wrong path. So, yeah, cool. Thanks.
Thank you.